We have some breaking news for you. The federal election campaign will begin tomorrow. This is information that's just coming into our newsroom right now. The federal election campaign is going to begin tomorrow. There was a lot of talk about when exactly that federal election campaign would begin. Sunday was the last day that the Prime Minister would be able to call an election. Here's a shot of Parliament Hill, but Canadians are going to the polls. We know this because we have fixed election dates in this country now. Canadians are going to the polls on October 21st, but there was a question about when that campaign would officially begin. Many have argued that it already has unofficially begun, with leaders out across the country in select ridings and select regions of the country where they are hoping to make gains or to hold on to seats. But we are now hearing that the campaign is going to officially begin tomorrow. So that, of course, comes with the pomp and the circumstance of the Prime Minister visiting the Governor General at Rideau Hall, Payette, where there's a formal ask for this election campaign to begin. And of course, it will be granted. That's expected tomorrow morning around 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. But the federal election campaign, again, this is not a surprise. It was just whether or not it would be called tomorrow, the next day, maybe as late as Sunday, but we are learning that the election campaign is going to begin tomorrow. We know that the Prime Minister, for instance, is in Nova Scotia today, visiting some areas that have been hit hard by Dorian. So the Prime Minister, Ralph Goodale, and other ministers and members of Parliament for Nova Scotia are in the area, and but that the Prime Minister will be back tomorrow, or probably later today, in Ottawa. David Cochran is our CBC reporter, and he is in Ottawa. So David, there it is. We now know when the election campaign is going to officially begin.
Yeah, Andrew, it was really only a matter of time. It either had to happen, today or tomorrow or any time between now and Sunday. Some timing complicating factors this week were the Manitoba election, which is happening today, and also the tropical storm and hurricane that hit Atlantic Canada, with power out and people in desperate situations there. In certain parts of the country, in my home turf, they didn't want to be insensitive and call the election until they had a clearer sense of just where things are. So they were running out of runway, though. This has to happen by Sunday for the minimum length campaign. A much shorter campaign than last time, Andrew. Not the 78-day marathon that we had in 2015 with $50 and $60 million spending limits. A more conventional length campaign this time of just 5.5 weeks with about $30 million, $28 million spending limits for the national campaign. So you've been seeing the ads. If you've been watching any kind of live sports, the campaign ads have been running very steady now for the last couple of weeks. So leaders have been fanning out across the country, in effect doing campaign-style events in what's technically the pre-writ period. It all gets started officially tomorrow. The sense we have is that the Prime Minister will go to Rideau Hall to see the Governor General at around 10 a.m. After that, Justin Trudeau will make statements as to his rationale for re-election and then get on a plane and travel to a destination unknown at this point. Andrew Scheer had planned to launch his campaign officially tomorrow, whether the election had been officially called or not. He's going to have a rally event in Trois-Rivières and then move into the GTA. And Jagmeet Singh, of course, had a launch. He released his platform on Father's Day, had a launch with a rally in Toronto this weekend, and is going to be in London, Ontario tomorrow when this all gets started. So we're seeing in the initial stages right away, Andrew, where the key battlegrounds are going to be. The GTA, the major regional centers in Ontario, Quebec, of course, and eventually all of the candidates are going to make their way to British Columbia, where we expect Elizabeth May to kick off the Green campaign.
Yeah, so let's unpack some of this,
Sure.
David, because there was a key question around the timing. As you mentioned, you don't want to appear insensitive with a hurricane that's just hit Atlantic Canada, so you got to be careful about that. But then there was some question: are you going to push it right to the end, to Sunday, which would have been the last day that you could call it? Are there advantages, disadvantages to calling it tomorrow versus Sunday, or are we getting into the weeds?
I think that might be kind of weedy, although that was more of an issue in 2015 when legalizing it was a big campaign promise. But look, 96 hours is not going to change it at the front end when everyone knows when voting day is. The fixed election laws that we have in this country now have been adopted more and more at the provincial level. It sort of takes away that real advantage of surprise in a massive way. for the government. Where it can come into have a significant strategic and tactical impact is like what Stephen Harper tried to do in 2015 when the Conservatives were sitting on a giant pile of cash compared to everyone else. The longer the campaign, the higher the spending limit, and that was widely criticized as trying to game the system last time. This is why we have new laws going into the 2019 campaign that gives a minimum length and a maximum length of like between 36 and 50 days. So Wednesday versus Sunday, I mean, you could keep going around on the taxpayer's dime and doing announcements, if you are the Prime Minister for the next several days. But we had a sense that somewhere between the 8th and the 15th was where election kickoff was going to fall with this Prime Minister. We were sort of given the sense that he doesn't really like big surprises and long campaigns. Is fairly traditional on these things. So this is right in that sweet spot between the 8th and the 15th. So tomorrow is when it's all going to kick off for good.
Talk to us more about money. You were mentioning money, how much you can spend, and does it change once the election is called?
Yeah, so there becomes very strict limits. There's a pre-writ spending limit that especially applies to third parties. We've seen that with Unifor running a lot of ads attacking Andrew Scheer primarily. There's limits on what they can spend, and they have to register as an official third party with Elections Canada. Once you get into the official writ period that comes when the campaign kicks off, spending limits kick in at the national level and at the riding level. And the financial advantages in this campaign, it really skews heavily towards the Conservatives and the Liberals. The Conservatives have been raising a lot of money at the top line national level. The Liberals will come in second there, but the Liberals are in much better shape than they have been at the riding level. They have almost as much money in local campaigns as they do for the national campaign, which is something they didn't have in 2015. They have 3 to 4 times as much money this time at the local riding level than they did in the past, which will allow them to mount far more robust and significant local campaigns, which is a significant advantage when you are the incumbent in the majority of seats. Money is going to be a storyline for the New Democrats. Their fundraising has been anemic since Jagmeet Singh has been leader, though to be fair to Mr. Singh, it predates him to when the NDP met in Edmonton and decided to get rid of Tom Mulcair as leader. He was allowed to stay on as the leader while they picked a successor, and their fundraising and outreach kind of atrophied in that period as Mulcair really didn't have much incentive to do the legwork of a leader, knowing that he had been ousted. So their ability to run a big, robust national campaign with a lot of ads is going to be restricted, certainly relative to the Liberals and the Conservatives, who the smart money, Andrew, is on one of those two parties forming the government on October 21st.
And in fact, if I remember correctly, either the Greens have more money than the NDP, or they're close, right? The Green Party, I mean, it's in that ballpark.
Yes, I think that battle between the Greens and the New Democrats for that third party position on the national level, I mean, the Bloc Québécois is obviously in this, the People's Party of Canada, but those appear to be the two parties. Right now, if you look at the polls, it would suggest that one of those two will have the third most seats, and in a lot of ways, they're competing for that same cohort of progressive voters. Now, it's different depending on which part of the country you're in. In rural NDP seats, it tends to be the blue-orange switchers, but in the BC Lower Mainland in particular, where Jagmeet Singh has his seat on Vancouver Island, where Elizabeth May has hers, there is a real battle for the progressive alternative to the Liberals between the Greens and the New Democrats. So financial resources certainly help the Greens there by having more money and a more concentrated electoral battlefield for them. The New Democrats still have to hopscotch right around the country because they've got seats in Saskatchewan and Ontario, in the industrial parts of Ontario, and the northern parts of Ontario in particular. So that is going to be a fascinating race in this election, Andrew, because the splintering of the Progressive Coalition, those left-of-center voters who came to the Liberals big time in 2015 to give them majority government, that is degrading. The polls are showing that has splintered a little bit, with the Greens and the NDP being the parties that are trying to capture some of that disaffected progressive and particular youth votes. It could make the difference between who's third and who is fourth when all of this is done.
So let's talk, though. You mentioned polls. I know you're not Eric Grenier, you're not our poll tracker, but you mentioned off the top or near the top that this appears to be, at this stage, a battle between the Liberals and the Conservatives in terms of who will form government, minority or majority. What do the polls, generally speaking, in the last little while tell us about that?
So there's two ways to look at it, right? There's the top line numbers, and then there's the more regional breakdowns and splits. And if you look at the top line numbers, you essentially see, depending on the poll, depending on the week, a tie, a virtual statistical tie between the Liberals and the Conservatives. Where that gets a little bit misleading is when you talk about a thing like vote efficiency. The Conservatives have massive leads on the prairies, in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and in Alberta, where they are just way ahead of everybody else. So that drives their national top line support number way up. But, you know, if you win a seat 80-20 as opposed to 51-49, you still only get one seat. So vote efficiency starts to play in the Liberals' favor in a lot of ways. The real battlegrounds in this election is going to be that broad corridor of ridings from Windsor City Hall to the Quebec National Assembly and everything in between and sort of to the sides. So you're going to see a lot of bus traffic between southwestern Ontario to the capital region of Quebec, because that is where a vast majority of winnable swing ridings are in particular, and on the British Columbia lower mainland. The collapse of the NDP vote nationally relative to 2015 and certainly since 2011 tilts in the favor of the Liberals in a lot of key areas, such as around Windsor, Ontario, maybe in Hamilton in the 905s, and in London, Ontario, and certainly in Quebec. So those are areas where the Liberals could maybe pick up, despite the national trend line showing a 50-50 race between the Liberals and the Conservatives. Right now, if you look at that, and a lot of pollsters are doing these sort of advanced seat projections, a seat modeling projection favors the Liberals to come out of this election with the most seats. Now, whether that's a majority or whether it's a large plurality, that is a question that remains to be seen. But Ontario and Quebec are where the Liberals are targeting for gains. They expect losses in Atlantic Canada because they've got all 32, Andrew, so there's nowhere to go but down. The prairies are going to be tough for them, and then BC, the ground is still shaking in British Columbia. The Greens are in play, the New Democrats, the Conservatives, the Liberals, depending on where you go. The lower mainland in particular is very volatile and unpredictable. So the path to victory for the Liberals means gains in Ontario and Quebec to offset potential losses in the far east and the far west of the country. The Conservatives just need to do better everywhere. They're going to do extremely well in their traditional Western heartland. All the polls show that. History shows that. They need to get suburban voters in Ontario to come their way. They need to get the large regional centres in Ontario, such as Windsor or London, to come their way. And they need to make enough gains there in places that delivered for Doug Ford. Can deliver for Andrew Scheer. They've got a chance of winning this thing.
And I guess in Quebec, there's kind of it's interesting to watch Andrew Scheer kind of go after some people that are considering the Bloc Québécois again, who could be serious contenders here, saying, you know what, a vote for the Bloc Québécois, that's a waste. You know, you will be comfortable with a Conservative government.
Yeah, and the Bloc stands to gain from the decline of the New Democrats as well relative to 2015. And, you know, a year ago with their leadership situation, the Bloc looked like they were in real trouble. Their new leader, Mr. Blanchet, he's certainly stabilized things there and stands to grow. And Andrew, a very clear sign of just how important the Quebec vote is. We have the two debates being done by the official debate commission, the English debate and the French debate. Well, TVA, which is the biggest television network in Quebec, was not part of the official debate commission, so they wouldn't be carrying the signal. The Liberals, who have said no to the Monk debate and the Maclean's debate, which is going to happen Thursday night, they have said yes to TVA because they want as many voters in Quebec to see Justin Trudeau, the Liberal leader, debating the other national leaders, because their path to a guaranteed second term or getting a majority second term involves running up the score in Quebec and appealing to those voters in Quebec. And let's face it, Andrew, we know that has been the most volatile electorate in Canada over the last several elections. That has to be something that probably worries the Liberals a little bit. They are targeting Quebec as a place where they're going to grow and where they have the most seats right now, and to hold on to those. But campaigns matter, and they certainly have mattered in Quebec over the last several elections. So that's the one everybody is targeting and nobody is taking for granted.
Yeah, campaigns matter. I remember at the beginning of, now it was a 78-day campaign, but at the beginning of the 2015 election campaign, based on the polls at the beginning of that campaign, I think the Liberals were given a 2% chance of winning a majority. And then we know what happens. What happened, right? Campaigns do matter. So at this point, David, what do you think are going to be some of the issues in this campaign?
Well, if you go back to those polls for a second, and in some ways, you're going to have your obvious predictable issues. Affordability is going to be the word you hear the most. The Conservatives are really centering their campaign around the cost of living. You see it in all of Andrew Scheer's ads. I want to help you get ahead. I want to leave more money in your pocket. It's a very individual message. It's mostly talking about through tax cuts maybe and targeted programs that help individuals. The Liberals will also be dealing with this. They have no choice but to acknowledge this. They've done some big things to help middle-class families, in particular with the Canada Child Benefit. And they've got a pretty good economy, but there is a definite sense that a lot of people aren't necessarily feeling the lift from really what are macroeconomic numbers that aren't quite trickling down to the individual level in all social stratas and in all parts of the country. So you're going to see a real laser focus on people who are feeling like they are falling behind in a time of good job growth and good economic growth just because of the cost of heating or the cost of their internet and phone services or the inability to buy a house, for example. You're going to see a lot of focus targeted on that. So on the issues and the pitches, look for a lot of things there. National pharmacare will be something that the Liberals put in the window in some form or another. We don't yet know what that's going to look like. But it's all aimed at helping people make ends meet on basic cost of living issues. There is a larger sort of meta theme to watch in this election, Andrew, and that's voter turnout. The Conservatives consistently get 5.5 million voters in elections, give or take a little bit. The Liberals in the last election went from 2.7 million voters to 7 million voters, when they surged from third to first. Trudeau needs to sort of recapture some of that unicorn magic he had in 2015 to hold on to that, because if that turnout starts to go down, splinter to other parties, or just stay home because they feel disappointed in the Prime Minister's first term in office, because there have been some setbacks and disappointment for progressive voters in particular. When you look at the pipeline purchase, the broken promise on electoral reform, the SNC-Lavalin scandal, these are issues that drive people away or encourage them to stay home. The Conservatives can't grow their vote to get over 7 million. That seems unlikely at this point. So what they need to do is take that 5.5 million and stop it from being 30% of the vote, maybe have the voter turnout go down a little bit, and that 5.5 million becomes 36% of the vote or 35% of the vote. And so a turnout versus apathy/suppression meta strategy is going to be something to see there. And Andrew, with the third party campaigning we've seen in the Ontario election with Ontario Proud, we've seen Canada Proud registered for this election. I think the Liberals are worried about a lot of noise and a lot of clutter on the outside from third parties and on social media to just sort of turn people away, discuss them, and drive them out of the process and maybe convince them to stay home. This is, I know, something the Liberals are worried about and something they need to actively work against in their messaging to return Justin Trudeau back into that sort of inspirational figure he was in 2015.
All right. Well, it's going to be exciting. David, I know you'll be a big part of the coverage. Probably not a lot of sleep over the next 5.5 weeks, but that's the way it goes. David, thank you. The CBC's David Cochran in Ottawa.